Welcome back to Emancipations podcast. Daniel is here with Francesca Antonini. Welcome to the program. Francesca, how are you this morning?
Thank you, Daniel, for your invitation. I'm fine. Thank you.
Yes, so it's wonderful to have you. Francesca Antonini is a professor, a historian based in Venice, Italy, at the Ca Foscari University, and is a scholar of Antonio Gramsci's work. Today, we're here to discuss a newly translated work. Is this book translated, or did you actually write it in English?
I wrote it in English originally.
Aha.
I translated into Italian recently, but the original version is the English one.
Fabulous. And so I'll obviously link to the book, which is published with Historical Materialism. I'll link to it in the show notes, but this is on the concept of Caesarism and Bonapartism, in particular in Gramsci's work. So this is actually a very important concept. A lot of folks on the sort of American left in the Marxist milieu have been reintroducing the concept of Bonapartism in our general political discussions. And a lot of, yet there still exists a lot of, maybe you could say, confusion regarding the meaning of Bonapartism. It is a theory, you could say, of historical repetition, on the one hand. You could also say it's a theory of political leadership. It's also a theory of social class and social class formation and the management by the ruling class for their own stability in the face of crisis. So it also introduces the concept of the crisis of the capitalist system itself. And of course, its origin in Marxism begins with Marx's text, The 18th de Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which is, one of his probably the most important political interventions of Marx, on the political side. Francesca, would you sort of perhaps begin by sharing a general sense of the meaning of Bonapartism for Marx to kick us off here?
Yes, of course. I would like to start by stating how nowadays Caesarism and Bonapartism, these twin concepts, are getting more and more popular, I would say, sadly, also due to the contemporary political situation. And but this is, so to say, quite a good thing for me as a scholar, since I have the opportunity to discuss my research topics also outside my scholarly contacts, so outside my groupings. And I think it's important also to make some clarity in the meaning of the concepts. As you aptly reminded, there is quite a confusion about what Caesarism and Bonapartism mean. In fact, they are both political categories, which has been adopted to polemize often, but also there are also scholarly concepts that can be applied to interpret and to understand history and past events, so to say. And this is on one hand the richness of this concept, what makes them so interesting, also from my perspective. But on the other side is also what makes the research and the discussion on Caesarism, if you want to talk about that in general terms, so confusing and chaotic, also in nowadays political life, for example. I think it's interesting. So it's important to remark that Caesarism and Bonapartism are concepts that were created in mid-19th century France. They are neologisms. You might find them so. Bonapartism is slightly more ancient than Caesarism. And in spite of their relatively short life, they've been interpreted in many ways by scholars, politicians, intellectuals across the 19th and the 20th century up to our own century, so to say. Marx's reading of the concept of Bonapartism and Caesarism is probably one of the most famous ones. Also because of the political approach connected to that reading, of course, but it represents, so to say, only one stream within the broader definition on Caesarism and Bonapartism, a stream which is very specific and also very precise insofar as it relies on another very important category of Marx theory, that is that of the balance of the class forces. So we might find in the late 19th century interpretations of Bonapartism a variety of approaches which do not refer to this concept, which is specific of Marx reading. You mentioned his famous book, The 18th Primaire Bonaparte, which was published for the first time in 1852, and for the second time in the most famous edition in 1969. The 1869 edition contains the famous preface in which Marx rejects the concept of Caesarism, describing it as a form of historical anachronism, and accept, on the contrary, the concept of Bonapartism as more appropriate to interpret his own reality, or the reality he is trying to describe. The history of Marx's book is not so easy, actually, since we have also many versions. Marx reworked the text, modern ones, also the basis of his current political situation and his political aims, of course. But it remains, as you said, the 18th Brumaire remains one of the most beautiful and readable, I would say, pieces by him, historical pieces by him. And for these reasons, many scholars, many historians or philosophers have studied the text and are still currently working on it. After Marx, we might say that the concepts of Caesarism and Bonapartism take different paths, insofar as, first of all, the concept of Caesarism was reassessed, first of all, by Engels, which used it in some of his texts, and on the basis of Engels' rereading of Caesarism, other scholars, other intellectuals adopted it. We might mention many of them, last but not least, Gramsci. We might say, for instance, that Gramsci's reading of Caesarism and Bonapartism is, of course, faithful, insofar as he refers to Marx's original text, in particular the 18th Primaire Bonaparte, but also the other so-called historical texts by him. But it's not faithful insofar as he further develops the regional Marxian categories. And we might say that we have the same situation also for rather socialist or communist scholars, intellectuals, politicians from the 20th century. Let's mention, for instance, Trotsky or the other key figures, the socialist panorama. So, in short, we might say that in spite of its brevity, or in spite of the fact that the concept are relatively newborn in the framework of the political concept, or the Western political concept that we adopt, the history of the Bonapartists and Caesarism is particularly troubled, and we have different streams, different ways of reading them. The Marxist reading is one of them, and it was one of the most successful, I would say, insofar as we had many authors after Marx that tried to reread Marx's interpretation of that.
Thank you for that. Now, a couple of follow-up questions. First off, in Napoleon's own, the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte, we could just rehearse as a reminder to people that at a certain point, he crowns himself a kind of emperor figure. He has an imperialist expansion that extends to Egypt, to Russia, and so on. And he sort of pacifies the revolutionary sequence and establishes a type of Caesarist rule. And this constitutes of a kind of it's anathema to the thrust of the revolution itself, and it represents almost like a archaic or sort of persistent form of domination that the system requires for its own stabilization, for its own rule. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, is this idea of repetition, right? First as tragedy, second as farce. This concept of repetition, which Marx is borrowing in part from Hegel, but also we see that Bonapartist figures emerge and emerge and reemerge and reemerge, and they take different forms. But at a functional level, they provide something very similar. So what is Marx's theory of the repetition of the Bonapartist? And what can you isolate as the sort of core functions? What does a Bonapartist do? Is every bourgeois politician Bonapartist? Or is a Bonapartist something much more specific?
Well, thank you for your question. Your question reminds me immediately one recent book by the US historian David Bell, who published his famous book, Men on Horseback, in 2022, if I'm correct. He reflects exactly on this issue of the repetition of the charismatic figures. In the book, he adopts a kind of variant reading key in order to interpret Napoleon I in this case, and other Bonapartist figures, if we might say so. And he tries to elaborate the reason of this success. He offers an explanation which is based on a kind of emotional reading on the power of love and of the embedding of love and leadership. So I think it's very interesting, and it's partly correctly. Actually, I think that he doesn't focus on Marx.
Yeah, I was going to say that does not sound like a Marxist view.
No, not at all. And it's probably one of the shortcomings of the book, if I may say so, from my perspective at least. Since in Marx, we do not find this kind of reasoning.
Right.
And the only mention of the principle of analogy is that you're also quoted. So first is tragedy, then is farce. In the book, we already mentioned 18 Bonaparte. He focuses only on Napoleon III, so not the nephew, not the uncle, so to say, which is not the most famous one nowadays, but he was the figure who really shaped the theory of Caesarism, according to Marx, but not only according to him, according to the entire 19th century, I would say. So we might say that Marx is very cautious in adopting this principle of the repetition. So he suggests the existence of death insofar as he retraces in Napoleon III's behavior some elements that were proper of the politics, of the warfare of his uncle. So you mentioned the relationship between the external and internal politics, which, as historians know, is a crucial point of the Second French Empire. But I think, so it's my impression is that Marx is always very, it's a bit skeptical, if you might say so, of this employment of historical analogy. He doesn't like it. And this is also the reason why he rejects basically the category of Caesarism. Otherwise, we might say that the success of Caesarism and Bonapartism, mostly of Caesarism, relies exactly on this analogical power, which is very strong which is strongly highlighting the successes of Marx and Marx readers. And this is also one of the main points of Gramsci's reading, in my perspective. He relies very much on this analogical power, on the power of the past, in order to interpret the present. As you said, we have repetition of Bonapartist, Caesarist figures, but which is not properly a repetition. So we have every time something that changed, something that have been changed, or something should be changed in order to adapt the Caesarist attitude to the new historical, political, economical, social context. And this is the most fascinating aspect of Caesarism, probably, but also what makes it so slippery, what makes it so difficult to interpret. Basically, and here I'm returning to Bell's book. That's why I was quoting him at the outset of my answer. I think that in spite of these changes, these different nuances of Caesarist power, we might retrace some basic features that return in every Caesaristic figures we might identify in the 19th century or also in the 20th century. And these might basically be identified, I think, with the existence of a leader, of a person, a man, traditionally male figure, which is able to exercise his power on the masses. The way in which he exercises his power are based not only on rational or legal tools, not just through these elements, constitutionally instituted elements, but also through the force or the fascination of his own character. So his own personal features are playing a role in his being a Caesarist figure. In this sense, I agree with Bell, with his argument that I was mentioning. And then the second and probably most obvious element that we need in order to have a Caesaristic situation is the presence of the masses, the popular masses, the mob, if you want to adopt another word. This is, of course, also a kind of slippery concept. We might ask ourselves, what are really the masses?
Right.
Do they have a personality? And you, as a scholar interested also in psychoanalysis, you might know better than me what means reflecting on collective psychology.
So
this was a hot topic across the 19th and 20th century, within and without the Marxist thought. Yeah,
that's very helpful. I suppose the liberal or the non-Marxist theory of Bonapartism, which relies very much on the charismatic theory of the dictator, of the Caesar, of the leader, one of the things that it cannot see or that it fails to account for is something that I think Marx did account for, which is that the charisma of the Bonapartist is often paradoxical because it's usually a reflection of social fragmentation, meaning that the charisma, say, of Donald Trump is almost like an anti-charisma because he's vulgar and he's rude and he breaks social taboos, he breaks norms. So you see the point, which is it's actually a kind of personification. The Bonapartist is a personification of the crisis of the class system, and they stand in for that crisis. They personify that crisis. They personify the fragmentation of class coherence on the one hand. I think on the other hand, and please correct me if you see it differently, one of the strengths of the Marxist theory of Bonapartism seems to be that it is a theory regarding how the bourgeoisie, as a ruling class, summons forth a leader that is often not from their class, but that leader satiates the deeper crisis of their class, right? And just as an aside point, the Japanese Marxist philosopher Kojin Karatani has a book on Bonapartism. I'm not sure if you're aware of it. It's very genius, where that's what he says. He says a feature of Bonapartism is actually that the Bonapartist has a tendency to come from outside of the normal party structure. They're kind of an exception. I was wondering if you might agree with that. Is that like a common feature of the Bonapartist on the one hand? And then on the other hand, do you agree that the Bonapartist has this paradoxical, vulgar quality, and how do you account for that quality? So it's very strange, I think, to most people, because intuitively people will say, why is this vulgar person captivating power? It should not be that way, right?
Yes, yes, I didn't mention the, so to say, economic social basis on which Marx theory relies. That was quite obvious. Maybe I should have expressed it more openly. This is, as you said, the key point of Marx reading. So, if we wouldn't have a reading of historical dynamics based on the combination of this class struggle, to use a classic formula, let's say, we do not have a proper Marxian reading of the events, of the phenomena, including Bonapartism, of course. And this is a distinctive feature of Caesarism, also in Marx reading. Let's think of the already mentioned the Ethan of the Bonaparte, but more properly, the other two historical works by Marx, the class struggle in France and the work on the Paris Commune. In the class struggle in France, an earlier text, so to say, or a collection made by earlier texts, and on the Saxon Commune, we find a more orthodox, if I may use this expression, an orthodox vision or interpretation of Caesarism, which is based exactly on this economic social reading. So the Bonaparte, the Caesar, emerges exactly because we have a struggle between the two main classes, two main groupings, and the balance that results from this struggle is what makes possible for the Caesar to emerge. And in this sense, it doesn't count very much the personality of the Caesar, which might be a weak person, a vulgar person, a person apparently a person that shouldn't, it's not fit in this role. In this sense, I understand, if I correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to say that it's kind of paradox. I agree,
Right.
however, I think,
But
however,
it's not a paradox from the position of the masses, from the proletariat, in some sense, because he is an expression of their discontent. It's a paradox from the position of bourgeoisie, because he represents an assault on their legitimacy. That's my understanding, but perhaps you see it maybe differently. I don't know.
I should say I see it usually as a kind of a third person. So something that is different both from the proletariat and from bourgeoisie, I would say. Anyway, I think that one of the most interesting things from my point of view are the differences, the slight differences that we might trace between this kind of orthodox or more traditional reading that we find, I repeat once again, in the class struggles in France and so on, and the reading that we find in the 18th man. I think that the reading that Marx offers in this book is more subtle. So here he seems to suggest that, yes, we have, of course, a balance, an equilibrium between the class forces, but there is also something more. That's why he's stressing so much in my initial presentation of Caesarism, of the key figures, of the key aspects of Caesarism, the issue of the personality, which I think it plays a role also in Marx text. So this doesn't mean that Marx was wrong or that he was correcting himself. As we know, Marx, as many others, big authors of the Western thought, we do not find a fully coherent theory, but we find different reflections which might contradict themselves. In this sense, the 18th Brumaire by Marx, I mean, is usually described as one of his heterodox books, one of his texts, which conveys a kind of heterodox reading of his own class theory. And in this sense, and because of that, The 18th Brumaire represented the key text for many heterodox Marxists, also in the early 20th century. Let's think of some German intellectuals or so on. I think, yes, the issue of the relationship between the charismatic and the Caesarist leader, we might adopt both concepts, both expressions, and his relation with the class, or his social origin, is a very interesting issue. And it's not by chance it was at the center of a variety of analysis, also of non-Marxist thinkers, or maybe no more Marxist thinkers. I'm thinking, for instance, of Robert Michels,
Yeah.
which is who is the famous elitist thinkers. He was initially a socialist, as we know, and then turned himself to the so-called elite theory, and he even adhered to fascism in his late years. He reflected quite extensively on Bonapartism in his work on the German Socialist Party, and he reflected exactly on this point of the external origin of the leader in relation to the class. And he re-elaborates a key point of Marx thought, of Marx theory, which is that of the relationship between the class and his leaders. So this reminds, of course, some very famous observations which are contained also in the manifesto or the other key texts of Marxism, so to say. But this relationship, as I said, is very interesting. I don't have a final answer, so it's an open question. It's an open on which we might reflect also from our own perspective. What means having a leader in our own time? Do leaders belong to our own society? Do we feel them like ourselves, or are they different? So,
yeah, this is very interesting. So, I feel that now is a good time to introduce Gramsci's theory of Bonapartism. Let us begin with his early theorizations, which I find very fascinating, frankly, because first, I think I want you to address the distinct Italian context of the Risorgimento, the various figures that emerged, the general Cadorna, in World War I. So he has these points of reference of actual political leaders. Obviously, in Germany, Bismarck emerges as a Bonapartist figure in his own way. And so you have emerge a kind of genealogy of Bonapartism that Gramsci is working with. But one of the very interesting texts that you reference is The Holy Family by Marx and Engels. And you show that in this work, Marx and Engels offer a criticism of romance novels, like romance serials, in the wake of 1848 revolution. And one of the things that I was so struck by was this notion that in Marxism, it used to be the case that in class theory, you use petit bourgeois as the middle class. So petit bourgeois is sort of what we mean today by the middle class. And in the early Gramsci, he is sort of theorizing Bonapartism as, and correct me if you see it differently, as almost like a perversion of the revolutionary thrust of the working class. And then in the romance serial novels that are popular at the time, picking up from what Marx and Engels pointed out, what you have portrayed are a series of depictions of social life that are kind of like role playing and perverting the authentic thrust of the revolution. And that is where you have this like petit bourgeois distortion of the revolutionary energy. Can you say something about this early Gramsci, the theory of romance, and also how that even links to fascism? We can get to that next, but perhaps first with this.
Yes, that's a very interesting question. So I will talk about Gramsci, but I would like to say just a few words on Marx, since, as you know, as many of your listeners know, of course, also Marx class theory is not as easy or as simple as it looks like. So while, for instance, in the manifesto, we have this split between the two main social groupings, the proletariat and bourgeoisie. In other texts, you already mentioned the class struggles in France, but also the Timberman or other texts. I'm not an expert of the economic texts, but you might find this distinction also in them. We find a variety of social groupings that are defined by Marx in different ways. So we do not have a binary position. We have multiple figures, multiple groupings that should be taken into account. And as you understand, of course, the combination of these of the relationships between these groupings might produce very different results depending on the point of view you adopt.
Exactly, because petit bourgeois has a similarity to the lumpen proletariat as it pertains to a moment of crisis. Because in a moment of crisis where the system is unstable, Marx will argue that one of the functions of the Bonapartist figure is actually that they use these contradictory class positions, which are otherwise not static, right? They're thought, well, they play catalytic roles in the moment of crisis in a post-revolutionary situation. Precisely, their function is to sort of, again, perform a distortion on the working class movement, on the proletarian movement. And that's why they become sort of dangerous in a certain way.
Yeah, the problem is the lacking of a proper economic basis in Marx's view, traditionally. So this is the traditional reading by scholars. The fact that both the petty bourgeoisie, or better, the lumpen proletariat, which is not economically explained, or could not be economically explained by Marx himself, this represents a big problem in our canonical or fully heteroorthodox Marxist, not Marx and not Marxist reading of the class struggle system. This makes everything much more complicated. I'm not the first one stating that. There are generations of scholars who wrote extensively on these issues, and there are wonderful texts for those who want to further reflect on this issue. But this is a key point, should be recorded, I would say. And it's too often neglected also in basic or introductory explanation of Marx theory, while I think should represent an important point of this explanation, of the teaching, for instance, too. But let's move to Gramsci, if I may. As you said, or you just mentioned that briefly, my book is a quite specialist one, I would say, since I adopt a strict philological approach, philological method of reading Gramsci, in which I was instructed when I was a student at my university. I learned to read Gramsci in this way. And I would like to say from the outset that this is just one way of reading Gramsci. So one might not agree with my way of approaching his text and might prefer a more free reading of the text, a reading which is not so much connected to the textual issues like variance, the chronology, or this apparently, in my perspective, minor things. One might prefer a broader and even more daring reading of Gramsci. And we have wonderful examples of this way of approaching Gramsci. We might mention the names of various scholars from the post-colonial intellectuals who read Gramsci in a very peculiar way, in their own way, which is a quite disputable reading from my philological perspective, but it's fully right in their own perspective. So this is kind of
No,
pretentious.
it's worth meditating on your point, precisely because Gramsci himself, when he read, precisely because he's imprisoned and his life was a revolutionary life, he had limited access to a lot of the texts that he desired to master. So he was prevented even from reading all of Marx's work. He was relying on translations which were not good, things like that. And but still, nonetheless, he was highly productive with what he had available. So it's interesting.
Yeah, this is very interesting. So that's what I find fascinating. Exactly.
Well, it's like there's this little thing. Just as a side point, I recently wrote a book on Friedrich Nietzsche,
Yeah.
and Nietzsche, obviously, if you look at the history of philosophy, it would be inevitable or mandatory for a philosopher like Nietzsche to write about and reference Immanuel Kant, right? Well, we now know that Nietzsche never read all of Kant's critique of pure reason. He only read secondary literature. In the same way that Jean-Paul Sartre, when he wrote Being and Nothingness, had never read Hegel, but still, he has references to it. So you see my point. It's like a bit interesting how philosophers, you would think that they take this philological fine comb rigor. It's not always the case, is what I'm trying to say.
I think the philological reading helps in explaining exactly what you said. So the philological reading of Gramsci allowed me to demonstrate that he didn't read important texts of Marx by Marx. So this is the point, I think.
That's right. And you show how what he would read from non-Marxist literature, how it would shape his thought, things of that nature, which we can get into those points too.
Yeah. But let's return to Caesarism and Bonapartism. By the way, in one chapter of my book, I try also to reconstruct the readings that Gramsci made in prison and before the imprisonment, with reference to Caesarism and Bonapartism. Mainly, I try to demonstrate how, first of all, that he read the 18 Brumaire, the other historical texts by Marx, and how he read them. I make numerous references to boring things like editions, translations, but I think this is the key point.
Can you, before you elaborate his concepts here, can you tell us, if you are knowledgeable of this question, how did Antonio Gramsci, what was his method of note taking? Do you know? Like, could you explain that? When he read, like, say, the 18th of Brumaire or the class struggle in France, like, how would he take notes on a text like that?
Actually, he doesn't take notes. So while I was writing my book, I was able to use his own library, which is now possessed by the Gramsci Foundation in Rome. Everyone can access it. Can just make a request, and you can use his own books, or at least a part of them. So a part remained by the family, and Russian family in particular, but most of them are now in Rome and are freely available to everyone. And my surprise, I was really surprised when I was going through his own diction of the 18th Brumaire, and I found no notes, no underlining, nothing. I think this can be explained in two ways. On one hand, he was very much used to learn by heart, which was typical of the 19th century culture. So especially the Italian classical education was hugely based on this reading by heart. So he knew a lot by heart. On the other hand, he also did this absence of notes of science of reading is explained with his necessity to produce his own text very quickly. He was a journalist after all, so he hadn't time to take notes, to write scholarly books. He needed to write a piece for tomorrow's journal, for the newspaper. So he had a very different way of reading text very different from my own, for instance, or from your own. I would have underlined everything, taking notes.
Do you find it ironic that Gramsci is treated by contemporary scholars in this way when, in point of fact, he was not preparing his works as a scholar, as you say? He was. Do you find that's kind of an asymmetry? It's a very interesting, because in a certain way, you could say that Antonio Gramsci's theory is almost treated almost like a sacred holy grail. In other words, there's a view that even though he's in extremely precarious positions with his health, he's imprisoned, he has this political background, which is unimaginable by our standards. Yes, all of that's happening, but people look at what he's producing and they are pointing out that strategically and at the level of praxis, something here is so deeply profound. And of course, that's true. If you just read the prison notebooks, it's very evident that there's a level of a kind of profundity that's unsurpassable. Do you have a theory as to his genius in that way? Have you thought about that? In other words, like what might account for that fact of his, I guess you could say of his genius. Have you thought about that?
Well, I think that also the scholars or people who do not love Gramsci should agree that he was an uncommon figure, so intellectually speaking, especially because of his capacity to keep together the everyday's life, the day-by-day chronicle, and the eternal truth or the long-term political perspectives. This is true. This is quite astonishing, I think. And this can be explained also through the reference to his journalistic background, to the way in which his personality and his political thought was shaped, I think. There is a very famous expression, I remind that, but so readers of Gramsci know that, of course. In a letter he wrote at the beginning of his writing, the prison notebooks, he wrote to his sister-in-law he wanted to do something forever, für ewig in German. So he recognizes that he's trying to combine the day-by-day dimension, his small work or apparently useless work on the chronicle published on a specific journal, on a specific day, on a specific book, and so forgettable, on a forgettable topic, with his work to construct or reconstruct socialism, which is of course huge and a work that projects him on another dimension. This is probably one of the most fascinating aspects of his own writing, the prison notebooks. If we talk, however, of his pre-prison writings, in these writings, the day-by-day dimension is prevalent, or is more relevant, especially because of, since he was still an active politician, he was still acting as a politician, he was engaged in his day-by-day political life. So in that sense, I think that reading the prison notebooks, having an even basic knowledge of his pre-prison writings, of his pre-prison life, is useful in order to give us an insight into his own conception of writing or political writing in order to do politics. I don't know if I've been clear enough.
No, that's good. I would say what's so fascinating about Gramsci is his capacity for the invention of concepts that describe that are strategic in a certain way for the cause of international socialism, revolutionary socialism, as well as these concepts that describe complex historical social phenomenon. In that sense, it's an art of a reading method that is of an extremely all-inclusive like in that sense, he's something like a polymath, right?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So let us now turn to his early theorization of Caesarism and Bonapartism. How does he first begin to think these categories, and then work up to the question of the romance serials?
Yes, finally. So in my book, I try to proceed as systematic as possible, investigating all the occurrences of the terms Bonapartist, and so on, and Caesarist, and so on, in Gramsci's writings. That's why I was making the premise about my method. This is to explain why I focus on two apparently neglected or collateral category in Gramsci's thought. If we count, basically, if we count the references to Caesarism and Bonapartism in Gramsci's pre-prison and prison writings, you can count them on hand, basically. They're not many. I tried to demonstrate their relevance in spite of their relatively limited number of the occurrences. In particular, my thesis is that in the pre-prison writings, he adopts mostly or preferably the category of Bonapartism, while the category of Caesarism is used only occasionally, I would say, and with no reference to a broader philosophical or historical political theory, so to say. In particular, he refers to romance, as you mentioned, and Caesarism and romance, mainly on the basis of Marx reading of the whole family and of this kind of description of bourgeois politics as something that should be mocked, so to say. I argue that the most important category at that time was that Bonapartism. So, can you hear me, Daniel?
I can, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was just freezed. I argue that he adopts mostly the category of Bonapartism in order to stigmatize or to criticize, firstly, his own party members when he was still a member of the Italian Socialist Party, and then his former comrades after the foundation of the Italian Communist Party in 1921. In particular, he uses the concept of Bonapartism in order to describe a sick or misinterpreted relationship between the leader and the masses within the political party. We have some texts which are, I wouldn't say famous, but quite famous, at least within the circles of the Gramscian scholars, in which he criticizes the attitudes by the first socialist leaders, and which might be read also as a first elaborations of the pillars of his late his late theory. So his theory of the philosophy of praxis, so to say. Personally, I have to say that in spite of the limitedness or scarce number of references to Caesarism and to romance, I found those references, those hints, more interesting. Also because of the connection with Marx, as you said. So in this text, in which he criticizes the Italian culture of that time, basically, he tries to describe the moral nuance or the moral dimension of his own society, with the difference that, or differently from other authors of his own time, he's not just criticizing that for the sake of doing that, of making moral criticism, but he wants also to suggest also or put forward a political criticism in doing that, and the way in which he shows to know and to use the Marxian text is very is very interesting. He's doing what is described as a pastiche, mixing different Marxian texts that he read in the late 10s and early 20s in order to create his own reading of Marx. And this will represent the basis for his later reading in the prison notebooks.
Yeah. So that's very helpful. So at this point, Bonapartism refers to it could be used as a pejorative against the socialist comrade who's acting in an egotistical way against the interest of the party.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one. Two is the notion of parliamentary cretinism. Can you explain what this is? And can you also bring in the essay on the monkey people? Explain what that is as well, please.
Well, the parliamentary criticism is a classical Marxian category. It's a category that Marx invented. It's so, as many other Marxian categories, is brilliant, I would say, but even its own formulation. Basically, Marx and Gramsci, after him, adopts this category in order to describe the conviction by members of the parliament to be able to really shape reality or influence society, while they do not have any real power on that. So they can't really change it just through parliamentary speeches or parliamentary queries. So this is the way this category is adopted by Marx and by other socialist thinkers, Gramscian first, in order to criticize politics as such. Politics conceived as something detached from society, from real life. In this sense,
yeah.
No, go on, please.
Oh, that's really helpful. Ferdinand Lassalle, the compatriot of Marx, I feel like this idea, the second idea we just mentioned of a Bonapartist within the socialist movement that's acting egotistical, you have here an interesting, I would say ethical, maybe if that's the right word, theory of sort of socialist leadership, which says that socialist leaders have to restrain themselves from their own desires for individual prestige, a certain way. And that when you witness that, and of course Lassalle is known for being a megalomaniac, right? You can kind of qualify that as a Bonapartist tendency or expression. Is that because he later, in the later reflections, he will talk about Trotsky and Bonapartism.
Yeah.
In other words, my question is, does that remain consistent? Does he refer to fellow socialists as Bonapartist as this particular pejorative, or is that only an early Gramsci period tendency?
Also later, actually.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is exactly the point. As Gramsci scholars know, in his early writings, he stresses very much the ethical, as you said, the moral dimension of politics. He also mentioned at one point the idea of creating what he calls a club of moral life, Club de Morale. So he mentions this project, these ideas, when he was one of the representatives of the young socialists in Turin. And this expresses very well the connections he makes between politics and ethics, so to say. Later in the prison notebooks, he would talk about moral and intellectual reform.
Mm-hmm.
So this thread remains open, so to say, even if it remains more on the background, opening the floor for other more properly political concepts, I would say. And Bonapartism is connected to that as well. So you mentioned Trotsky. In particular, in prison notebooks, he connects the figure of Trotsky with the concept of Bonapartism, with the more general developments in Russia the way in which revolution was put into practice, and the Trotsky's idea of the revolutionary army in particular. You mentioned before, and here I'm returning to Gramsci's pre-prison text, the General Cadorna. So, as an example of a Bonapartist attitude outside the Socialist Party in this case. But he's a Bonapartist insofar as he rules the masses as objects, not as groups of people. So this missed attention for the moral status of the people is what characterizes the Bonapartist attitude within and outside the party.
I was wondering, where is Stalin in relationship to Bonapartism for Gramsci?
Can I reply?
Please.
Yeah. This is a quite different question, since we do not know exactly what Gramsci knew about Russia when he was in prison. So,
but he had spent time there.
He spent time in Russia before.
Yeah.
We are talking, so scholars, Gramsci scholars.
Before 1917, he was in Russia, right? Or was it after?
He was in the 20s in Russia.
Oh, so he was after 1917. I see.
He was in the 20s.
Got it.
And he, the experience, so the years he lived in Russia were very formative, both for his political and intellectual attitude. But I think we should distinguish between the experience he had in Russia at that time and the idea, or what he thought about Russia, but the Russia of the 30s, which is by far more complex to understand. So, as you remembered before, this is due, first of all, to the lack of sources, the lack of information. He had basically no information about what was going on in Russia at that time. He had some indirect information through his friends and through his Cicero, but was very mediate. And he was not, you might say, that I'm saying that very boldly, although it's not so simple at all. He was not fully alienated with the line of the Russian leadership at that time. And the Italian politicians, the Italian communists knew that. So there's kind of a misalignment between him, the Italian comrades, and the Russian leadership. This is the point. This is the reason why Stalin is mentioned also under a kind of fake name in the notebooks. We have only one note. If I'm not wrong, should be paragraph 53 of notebook 17, which means quite late, a quite late note, in which he mentions Bessarione, which was a kind of struggle name for Stalin, and he expresses some disagreements with his own with Stalin's politics. But as I said, it's a highly disputed question. So I would say that we should deepen this theme separately from what he said about Bonapartism, Caesarism. Of course, we have a kind of entanglement between concepts. In the note I was just mentioning, he refers to a certain extent also to a Bonapartist attitude, but it's much more than that. So his judgment on the Russian leadership, the international communist movement should not be limited to that. And to a certain extent, it's very hard to tell what he was thinking of that. If he agreed, if he disagreed. Were many ideas, many positions have been taken by scholars on that.
Sure.
But quite polemical, I would say there are scholars who said that he wasn't a communist anymore, which I think is wrong, of course.
Yeah.
At a certain point.
Yeah. I want to read an interesting quote about the early Gramsci and how Bonapartism relates also to his definition of fascism. On page 24, you say Gramsci defines fascism. I'm just going to read this quote. The petty bourgeoisie has an essentially destructive nature and is unable to create a new order. As a consequence, fascism will also inevitably fail in this effort.
Yeah.
And what you have here is the idea that the Bonapartist is almost like a kind of political leader that is meant to institute the demands of the middle class, of the petite bourgeoisie, but they fail to adequately satiate those demands, and so it's like an impossibility. And from that impossibility, something like fascism will inevitably sprout. That's like a one way to think about it. So can you talk about his concept of petite bourgeoisie, the middle class, and fascism? It's a very interesting in the early period. Can you say more about that for us?
Yes, I would like to focus or mostly to start from fascism because I think it's the most interesting part. We might say that the definition of petty bourgeoisie he provides is kind of corollary of that to a certain extent. So this is at least my opinion. I would start by saying that fascism, although it's the obvious reference point for Gramsci, historically speaking, is not fully or so fully theoretically elaborated in the prison notebooks and in the prison writings as well. So it remains always on the background. It's the unavoidable point of reference, but at the same time, it remains to a certain extent, let me allow to use the expression, something not that it's not possible to fully understand. With my retrace, I try to make more systematic this reading of fascism by Gramsci, and it's not by chance that. So, if I might say that, also in the scholarly panorama of the Gramsci studies, we do not have a study fully dedicated to Gramscian fascism. So, it's kind of missing theme, and it's missing because it's missing or it remains on the background also in Gramsci's writing. So that's the reason why. In spite of that, I try to reconstruct with reference to the categories of theory of Caesarism and Bonapartism, what he says about fascism. That's not all that he says about fascism, but it's part of that. So this is my premise. I try to demonstrate how in his early writings, up to the early 20s, 91, 21, 22, to the latest, he describes fascism in the same way you mentioned. So as something that has an essentially destructive nature and unable to create a new order. Fascism is a form of romance. So and he connects, in fact, fascism or this representation of fascism to the imagery connected to the Italian poet D'Annunzio, which is also very unconstructive in this sense. In this sense, we might read also his reference to the monkey people. In brief, we could say that up to the, so even after the March in Rome, he was convinced that fascism was doomed to fail, was not something that would have remained, would have lasted long in Italy. He described it as something as that was doomed to be short-lived, so to say. He changed his mind quite rapidly in the following years, and especially in the period he spent in Russia. He returned extensively on that, and he realized that actually fascism was not just romance, but was something more. It was something that was being rooted in the Italian society quite deeply. And it is on this conviction, of this new reading of fascism, that he based his later reflections on the Italian fascist movement that we can find in the Prison Notebook. So there is an evolution, so to say, and we might not say that Gramsci, in rejecting fascism in the early 20s, was naive, because he was not the only one. And we might talk from our own perspective. We know that fascism represented one of the main totalitarian systems in the 20th century, but in the early 20s, I wouldn't say that no one could have forecast that, but it was likely to say something different,
No, it's true. It's all goes back to this logic of the balance of forces.
Yeah.
And that is present in the Brumaire. And you say that at this early period, he says fascism is the most energetic and active part of the Italian petty bourgeoisie that wanted to resolve, for capitalism's benefit and for its own class benefit, the situation of the balance of forces that existed in 1920 and 1921 between capitalism and the proletariat. So it's very interesting that he's here thinking the class of petty bourgeoisie as like this third class, where the Bonapartist kind of personifies and represents their interests. And that's very interesting if we look at like the Donald Trump movement, right, as a movement of dissatisfied petty bourgeois class figures, or as like an attempt from the standpoint of the interest of the petty bourgeoisie to remold the state, right? To remold the state based on their interests. But then the romance comes in because the worldview of their perspective is also a fake imitation of something revolutionary, which initiated with the proletariat, not with them. So in that sense, it's like a kind of an abuse of the proletarian movement. It's like but it's also a bad imitation, a bad repetition. Do you find that to be a compelling theory? I personally find it very compelling. How does he sort of change his theory of fascism, even though it's not a systematic one? Is this the most refined theory of fascism that you have in Gramsci? Or does he further elaborate it later?
So you asked me two questions. On one hand, if I find Gramsci's theory of fascism, as I sketched right now, useful for today? Was that your question? Yeah.
Useful, but also, like, does it have explanatory power for today? But also, even though you said a moment ago that there's no one theory of fascism for Gramsci, it seems to me that at this stage, this is a very robust and concise theory. Does he modify it in the future after this time?
Okay, I think that past is always useful to understand the present. So even wrong forecasts might be useful in order to understand what happened. So nothing is useless. In this sense, also Gramsci's theory is useful. What can we learn from it today? In short, I think that the existence of a leader or the charismatic personality of a single leader doesn't change anything. So that's not the point. So the petty bourgeoisie, in Gramsci's view, was convinced to be able to reshape society through the seize of power by a leader. But that's not the point. That's not how it works. So society can be changed only from the inside, only if we work on the economic movements, on the basic features of society. So it's a charismatic, a Caesaristic figure. It's not what makes the change possible. It might be a trigger. It might work as a trigger, and it has worked as a trigger in the past. Let's think of Napoleon I, various reasons, but it's not the main point. In this sense, I think Gramsci's theory of Caesarism, Bonapartism, and so on we should learn from that we should not trust leaders. But this is a reasoning that is so Gramsci is telling us that, but he's not the only one.
Yeah, I mean, you go on to say that it has to be thought in this sort of movement of the permanent crisis of the system, whereby if the working class proletarian movement doesn't seize a revolutionary edge in the battle, so to speak, of the class forces, he says that the Bonapartist figure will inevitably fill that space. So they fill a space that stabilize. They are, in that sense, they are a reaction to a pre-existent crisis on the one hand, but also a possible success of the proletarian position. Yeah. That then makes you see why he's willing to have this ethical theory, because within the socialist movement, it's very potentially alluring to socialist leaders to basically sell out and follow the third way, kind of like third way, right?
You may interpret what you're saying. What counts is the long-term perspective. So in one chapter of the book, I describe Gramsci's concept of history, like conception based on waves of history. So history is movement made of crisis, revolution, restoration. So Gramsci encourages us to interpret history, to learn to interpret history like a movement, like development, and not just to focus on the single episodes or the single leaders. In this sense, I think this is relevant. And as to fascism, as I said before, we have a change of perspective in Gramsci's view across the decades, and especially in the prison writings. In the prison writings, we find a much more refined and elaborate conception of fascism. And it's interesting to find, I explicitly discussed that in one chapter of my book, we find a kind of implicit comparison between the communist revolution, USSR, and fascist Italy. To a certain extent, they are on the same level, they're paralleled. They are these forms of what a brilliant Gramscian scholar has described it as alternative modernities. I think this is a key point. So fascism is not an exception. It's not a Sonderweg, to use a famous historical category. It's an alternative modernity. So it's an option people had in the past, you know?
That I've heard this phrase. It's very helpful, and I feel that the Bonapartist Caesarist thing. I mean, I can tell you my own theorization, building off of Gramsci, but also other Marxist thinkers, because it reflects. I really find that the prison notebooks theorizations of Bonapartism and Caesarism are very compelling, because on the one hand, unlike Marx, who rejects Caesarism, it seems that Gramsci does not reject Caesarism.
Not at all.
Right?
Not at all. No, he doesn't reject it.
Yeah. On the one hand. On the other hand, it seems also that this idea in Marxism of constructing the laws of history, where we have some, maybe you could say, predictability regarding these functions, it's like a functional historical law, is also further refined and specified by Gramsci. I wanted to ask you, Gramsci develops a distinction between different types of Bonapartist leaders. Yeah, this is very significant, and I myself and other Marxist thinkers that I read have taken Gramsci's idea and they've gone in different directions. I'll give you an example. How do you explain a Bonapartist who sides with the progressive element of the bourgeoisie in comparison to the Bonapartist who sides with the right wing? This is something Gramsci accounts for, right? Because it's
Yes.
I think it's soft and hard. Soft, hard. Is that correct?
Um, we might say so. As I try to demonstrate my book, uh, I say that we have a five kind of a scheme of Caesarism. So Gramsci tries to explore the different variations of the theme. So to say, we have progressive Caesarism, regressive Caesarism, Caesarism as a consequence of a contingent crisis, of a permanent crisis. We might have also something like what you describe like soft or hard Caesarism. I think it's the classification is not as important as it looks like. I think, for instance, as I try to demonstrate, this is incomplete. So it's only kind of sketch by Gramsci. So it's a way in which he tries to start exploring the theme. We might have add more variations on topics, more labels, so to say. And this is was part of the richness of his analysis, which is not concluded and limited in itself. As scholars has also demonstrated, has also claimed in the past, and my theory is exactly, my reading is exactly against these interpretations from the 70s or the 80s, which claim that, while we have in Gramsci the categories of Caesarism and Bonapartism, but are basically irrelevant. I try to demonstrate how that they are relevant and how they are relevant, and how they might be fruitful. So how they allow us to further reflect on them. So depending on the combination of factors we retrace.
So talk about, I think this is essential, the very, very important notion that Gramsci is famous for of passive revolution. Help us understand its placement within the wider theory of Bonapartism and Caesarism. How can you explain that for us?
I would read it from the other side. I think that Gramsci's theory of Caesarism and Bonapartism should be, let me use this expression, embedded in Gramsci's own theory of the passive revolution. So, passive revolution is, from my perspective, a broader category. It contributes broader than the category of Caesarism and Bonapartism. So, to a certain extent, we might say that Caesarism and Bonapartism or Bonapartist phenomena are a peculiar expression of passive revolution phenomena. This is my reading. I try to demonstrate the connection between the concept, also from the very philological point of view. This might be boring, probably.
Can you? Well, no. Could you start by giving us an overview, a sketch of the concept passive revolution, just in general?
Okay, a definition maybe. Yeah.
A definition, yeah, please.
Okay, so first of all, we should say that passive revolution is not a term that is coined by Gramsci, but is a term that he retraces in 18th century Italian historian Vincenzo Fuoco, who used it to describe the failure of the Neapolitan Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And in general, it's a term that Gramsci uses to describe the way in which society or worldview progresses thanks not to a propositive or a direct action of the proletariat or of the new classes, but thanks to the necessity of the ruling classes to adapt themselves to new circumstances. Is a way to survive. Basically, passive revolution is a way in which bourgeois power tries to survive, adapts itself to the new reality. It's a very rough definition. So Gramsci elaborates much more than that, but it's just to give you or give your listeners an idea of the concept. Should I?
No, that's extremely well. I think there's a couple historical reference points that I want you to elaborate, and then funnel back through Caesarism and Bonapartism. And the first is the Dreyfus affair, which you talk about quite a lot in the book. Could you, because we're talking about the concepts, which is helpful, but maybe we could link them to concrete historical examples. How does the Dreyfus affair, how is Gramsci theorizing this moment in European politics in history? And could you also just give us a brief sketch of that as well, if you don't mind?
Well, the Dreyfus affair, this specific episode of the French history of the early 19th century, is a key point also in the context of the philological reconstruction I was mentioning before. As readers of Gramsci know, he talks of passive revolution mainly with reference to Italy post-Unitarian history, that is the famous Risorgimento, but also other historical events or historical phases, so to say. But the Dreyfus affair, I would say, is it's very crucial and has been underestimated by Gramscian scholars when dealing with that concept. By the way, passive revolution is a concept that we find explicitly only very late in the notebooks, starting from notebook. So the most famous notes, paragraphs on the passive revolution are contained in notebook 15, which is, I would say, is one of the latest, so not one of the first one, of course. But interestingly, on the basis of these notes, he later rewrites some notes from notebook 1, for instance, on the Italian Risorgimento. So it's a concept that appears explicitly late, but that was actually present in Gramsci's view from the very beginning, I would say. It looks like as he discovered later the concept, but it was already there to a certain extent. And in this sense, also the Dreyfus affair is crucial. What happened? What means Dreyfus affair? We are in the context of the Third French Republic. We had the General Dreyfus, and he was criticized for his attitude in war and politics, and he was he basically he flew, he left, and then he committed suicide. This is basic history. Gramsci talks about the Dreyfus affair and the entire atmosphere of the Third French Republic in order to reflect on what passive revolution means and on the way in which historical events might develop. So while writing about these episodes of the recent history of France, he's showing how even if the situation was potentially reactionary, there were forces that were able to unlock the situation and therefore to evolve it in a way that was favorable to a more, I wouldn't say social, but liberal perspective. This is the entire reasoning on the Dreyfus affair. And this is reasoning that is contained basically, or more explicitly, I could say, in one note from notebook 14, and paragraph 23. I'm referring to the Italian critical edition when I mentioned the paragraphs in the notes. And in this text, we find, on the one hand, a definition of passive revolution and a definition of Caesarism. And I try to demonstrate that because of that presence of this presence in the same text, they're also philologically connected. And philology in Gramsci is not just philology. So philology means also going to the roots of his own thought. It means to demonstrate that the categories are connected theoretically. This is the idea.
So you had mentioned that the category of totalitarianism, which obviously is popularized by Hannah Arendt, did Gramsci have a fidelity to this as a theory of Caesarist rule? That, like, would he describe Caesarist rule as totalitarian? Is this a concept How does he relate to it? And so that's one question. And the second part, I wanted to ask you about Caesarism without Caesar. What's the meaning of this strange formulation?
Okay. So totalitarianism. I think this is a very good example. I quote it always to my students when talking about the intellectual history and history of concepts, which means studying the history of concepts. If a lay person should talk about totalitarianism today, he or she would think immediately of Anna Arendt's book. Actually, we should remember that the meaning of that concept was not always that was given by Anna Arendt. So for Gramsci, totalitarianism, or in the 1920s Italy, totalitarianism was very different. As I try to reconstruct briefly but thoroughly, I think, in my book, totalitarianism for Gramsci, or totalitarian, he doesn't talk about totalitarianism, but totalitarian, which is quite different since he adopts only the adjective. He describes communism as totalitarian, which could look like, from our perspective, this sounds strange, or not so strange if we think of the Stalin's Russia or this historical example. Actually, this was a positive connotation in Gramsci's view. It was a way to say or to stress that communism or communist theory should reshape society as a whole. Unfortunately, in the English translation of the notebooks, the translator, the editor, hasn't adopted the proper word. He talked of all embracing, which is less, is not so strong, I think. And the readers miss the conceptual power, the conceptual force of the term.
You're talking about Joseph Buttigieg, the translator?
Yeah. Because I understand why they did that, but they should have used the term totalitarian, which is more proper.
They did it to not create confusion because of I
know. But this is exactly the point. So Gramsci, but I'm not just talking of him. So we should understand concept in their own time.
Can we so when you, just as a quick side point, you said that it's not I talked to a lot of Marxists in an informal setting, non-scholarly setting, and they say, well, didn't you know that Antonio Gramsci was a Stalinist? How would you respond to somebody that was saying this kind of, off the cuff comment? Because before you said, well, it's pretty difficult to associate him with Stalinism, quote unquote. Is that true? Can you say something generally about Gramsci's relationship to Stalinism, if that's okay?
I wouldn't find Gramsci as a Stalinist. We might say he was communist. This is the most appropriate definition from my perspective. We might say that he was always, in spite of his disagreements with the regime, he was always a supporter of the socialist state. I think he never thought to reject or to abandon communism, and therefore the country in which communism was established. In this sense, we might say, despite his disagreements or potential disagreements, imagined disagreements, he was a supporter of Stalin, of course. He couldn't support him.
Understand. That's helpful. Thank you for that. And what is the meaning of the Caesarism without Caesar? It's a strange formulation, but could you define that, please?
First, should be reminded that Caesarism without Caesar is not the formula that we find in Gramsci's notebooks. So it's not written by Gramsci. It's a formula that I've taken from a brilliant scholar who has written that topic. It's Borgio. He's a historian of philosophy. He wrote illuminating pages on Gramsci, I think. I'm not sure. I think his books were never translated into English, Alice. I disagree with his conception of Caesarism, Gramsci, to be honest. But I think, in spite of that he was brilliant in creating this formula. And why I think that, which is an important aspect of this formula. When we talk about Caesarism, without Caesar, we allow us to interpret Caesarism not just as something negative, but also as something that is potentially positive. So Caesarism without a Caesar is basically referred to Gramsci's late reflection on the role of party, and particularly of the Communist Party, in reshaping Italian and European society after the fall of fascism and after the restoration of the liberty in Europe. This is the idea. These are topics that were not fully elaborated by him, of course. Just we find only brief mentions in the notebooks for obvious reasons. So he died in the late 30s. He couldn't have imagined what happened next. But this is a way to stress the neutral character of the concept of Caesarism according to Gramsci. So Caesarism, differently from Bonapartism, which has an explicit negative characterization, Caesarism might be positive as well, if properly reassessed and readopted. And this is connected, as I show running rapidly in the book. I wrote on that more extensively in other pieces of mine. There is a connection between Caesarism without Caesar, Caesar without Caesar, and the very famous concept of modern prince that he elaborated in order to describe the attitude of the Communist Party.
So the modern prince is sort of a typological form that would be of an ideal theory of leadership within a communist party.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how is the modern prince to be ethically thought, or what is the kind of could you say a little bit more about that? Like maybe how does he sort of elaborate this idea? It's very interesting.
Right. It goes beyond the scope of my book, of course, but
right.
Yeah, it's better. So you should talk with Peter Thomas about that, probably not with me.
Sure.
But yeah, basically we might define this concept as a way to describe a form of political leadership which is able to rule the people without imposing on them a specific decision or a specific attitude, but which is able to enhance or stimulate, to trigger the inner change of the people. Is a way to improve people themselves through the actions of the party. So this is one of the key points in Gramsci, I think. I think a quite undermined point of Gramsci's concept of modern prince is that it is connected to the category of discipline. So we imagine that discipline is considered as something negative in the framework of a conception which aims to establish people's liberty. Actually, discipline is a very positive concept in Gramsci's view. This is not so surprising if we think of the role of discipline in a historical Communist Party, but also in a more theoretical and philosophical perspective. The role of discipline is that of the establishment of the already mentioned moral and intellectual reform, which is the final scope of the modern prince.
Yeah.
So, as you see,
thank you very much. And how is Mikhail's charismatic leadership theory? Because he's read this analysis at the time, and that analysis is grounded, as you say, in a Max Weberian perspective, because Max Weber develops this theory of the charismatic leader, and then Mikhail's develops it further, and Gramsci is reading this material. Is he using those reflections combined with his Marxist perspective to develop his theory of the modern prince? And can you say a little bit more about this notion of the charismatic leader? How is he thinking through its problems?
Well, first of all, we should say that Gramsci didn't read Weber. If not, he read only probably two texts by Weber. The text on Germany, Parliamentary, I don't remember the English title of the book right now. Parliamentary Regierung that's in Germany. Okay, I don't remember the title, sorry. An early text by Weber on parliamentary life. And then Gramsci read also in episodes the text on the Protestant ethic. So he didn't know anything about the economy and society, basically, and the entire theory of the charismatic leadership. He knew something on that through the mediation of Michels, he read Michels more extensively, also because of Michels was part of the Italian intellectual community, and he was actively intervening in that. And Michels, as I tried to demonstrate in my book, he is an enemy of Gramsci, so to say, but played also a crucial role in triggering his reelaboration of the concept of Caesarism.
Right.
To a certain extent, it was a positive relationship between the two of them. He didn't read all the texts by Michels, of course. He knew only his basic text, and he focused also on some journalistic writings that he read when he was in prison. But since Michels repeats himself more than once, Gramsci basically understood his theory. I wouldn't say in any case that the Weberian approach or the Weberian theory of charismatic leadership is a source for Gramsci.
No.
So I would say that he knows of that. He's aware of the existence of that, but the influences of Marx is far more deep. So basically, as a tribe, so I created this expression that I use in my book, and hope it works usefully. Basically, while we have in the first phase in pre-prison writings a Gramsci who's trying to adapt himself to Marx theory, in the prison writings we find a Marx theory that is adapted to Gramsci's view. We have an original reading of Marx theory. In this sense, that's why Gramsci is so creative. Also, his own philosophy of praxis is his creation of the philosophy of praxis.
Okay, thank you so much. This is a final question I had for you. Well, I have two final things, and then I will let you go. Thank you so much for your time. We talked about passive revolution, and we talked before about Gramsci's early theory of romance, right? Are you aware of a Gramscian concept, which I believe is pronounced trasformismo?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm very compelled by this concept, and my understanding of the meaning of trasformismo is kind of similar to this idea, where you have it kind of refers to how an ideological expression of a class is sort of imitated, but then manipulated at the same time, and it kind of as I understand it, is used as a way in which the liberal hegemony, the hegemony of the liberal ideology of the bourgeoisie, ends up performing a kind of transformismo on revolutionary energies and consciousness. In other words, it's a way that they absorb and then distort them. And I was thinking to myself that that is very close to the early Gramsci theory of what Bonapartism does in some ways, right? Especially through the theory of romance. So I was wondering if you agree, maybe, or if you had thought about that connection. And it's a very brilliant idea. It's it's a cool concept, in my opinion, transformismo, because it explains, like, I'll give you an example. If in the United States, the centrist party learns that in order to satiate the discontents of the working class, they have to appear in solidarity with labor unions, but at a material level, they won't do anything for the labor unions. But they have, like, they then perform a kind of transformismo on it. Is that a kind of way to understand that concept as you are aware of it? And does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. We might say so. Actually, Gramsci didn't invent the term transformismo, which was used in the post-unitarian Italian politics in order to describe basically the changing of the change of party by the representatives in parliament. Basically, this is the historical definition of the term, of the category. This moving from one party to another of the representatives. But basically, the meaning is that you described. So the absence of real political convictions, and therefore the importance of the appearance only. So
It's like what we it's what we today call optics. If you heard this phrase in the American liberal media, in the liberal media, the way that people look at politics is through the lens of optics, which means perception. And so it's disingenuous because it shows that all they care about is perception.
Yeah.
So if you can control the perception, that's sufficient, nothing more than that, right? So it's a very, it's useful because it describes the kind of superficiality of bourgeois politics, let's say. So anyways, at some point, it would be very interesting to ask you also your theory of the current prime minister of Italy, Meloni, the female figure, and how, in a way, she seems to me to be very, very, very Bonapartist in her own way, in the sense of the kind of way that her power seems to express a sort of incoherent or irrational discontent of the masses. But that incoherence and her political leadership does not have any true interest in a true transformation of the condition of the masses. You know what I mean? In that sense, she's like, would you call her a Bonapartist? Would you be comfortable to classify it this way? Or do you, that's actually a final question in some sense. How do you want to encourage your readers to utilize a contemporary use of Bonapartism and Caesarism? Have you thought much about this, the way the terms should be applied today?
Well, I should say that I'm a bit uncomfortable with this kind of discussion. I'm a historian, basically. I'm more comfortable with history. But if we want to talk about the present, I would say that it would be a compliment to a certain extent to define Meloni or other European political leaders as Caesarism and Bonapartism, since this would mean to overestimate their real impact on society. I wouldn't say that they are passing stars, but to a certain extent it is true. So I do not see, this is my personal opinion, I do not see that she left so far any remaining, she didn't make any remaining choice on Italian society in this case. So while she's the expression of a certain political attitude, a very specific political attitude, which has which is enjoying a growing consent nowadays, the right, the far right in Italy, and not only in Italy, but she personally, I think also in the public opinion, as I see it, the public debate in Italy, she is to a certain extent a kind of blurred figure. So we might have her or another one. So I think that nowadays the real Bonapartist or Caesaristic figures are to be found elsewhere, I think, unfortunately, like in the US. I think we might have a different discussion when talking about Trump, for instance, at least from my perspective. So she's what Meloni and the representatives, the leaders of these far-right European moves and movements are doing rather to normalize their own being in power rather than expressing charismatic, extraordinary individual features or expressing individual choices. I don't know if you understand what I mean.
I think I follow, although where I would say that they would qualify as Bonapartist in my interpretation would be in the fact that they are defiant to the norms of the ruling class as it exists. So like the power of global institutions is a reflection largely of kind of the, if you like, the liberal center. And so these figures come, they come almost from a third point. They come from a non-traditional point of power. So, you know, there are a lot of symmetries to the Bonapartist figure, but I see your point that historically the Bonapartist figure is maybe contains more singularity for disruption of the system. And that's the other thing, that these figures kind of maintain the status quo. But again, my understanding of Bonapartism also is that Bonapartists kind of they do paradoxically maintain the status quo, right? So I'm of the mind that we can still use this category. Do you agree, or do you think that Bonapartism is quite rare and we should be more careful how we apply it?
No, this is a fashion of the historical analogies. It's really appropriate, I think.
Yeah.
So since we are aware of the historical distance, that's the point.
Yeah.
That's why I think Caesarism, Bonapartism, these categories are so relevant nowadays.
Well, Francesca, thank you so much for your book. It's an extremely rigorous, scholarly effort, and I just want to congratulate you on a job well done. It must feel very nice to have it out in the world, and I'll put a link to. Is it going to be available in paperback, or is it already available in paperback?
This is hard copy by Braille.
Yeah.
And this is the paperback.
You have the paperback. Okay, great.
It was published in 2021.
From so paperback is Haymarket.
Yeah.
I love that. That's a great arrangement between Brill and Haymarket, because the paperback is more affordable.
Definitely.
Good. Well, I hope everyone picks this up and learns about the brilliance of Gramsci and of your very, very original interpretations. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
All the best. Thanks everyone for listening.